The chamber alarm was already screaming when the human shuttle docked. Ethan Hall felt it through the floor before he heard it, a low pulse that shook the soles of his boots as the airlock hissed open. Margaret Doyle moved first, her coat still swaying from the change in gravity, her face calm in the practiced way of someone who had learned long ago not to let her expression give anything away. Behind her, Owen Blake gripped the strap of his equipment case so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "That is not a welcome signal," Owen said quietly. "No," Margaret answered. "It is not." They stepped out into a hallway of black stone and soft blue light, built by hands that were not human. For a purpose, humanity had only been allowed to witness for the first time, 11 months ago. The corridor curved upward in a way that made the ceiling feel like it was breathing. Attendants of 3 different species rushed past them without a glance, moving with the stiff urgency of people who had rehearsed calm for centuries and were now failing to hold on to it. Ethan had trained for a year to be here. He had studied 7 languages that were not built for human throats, memorized the etiquette of species who blinked sideways instead of down, and practiced staying silent for hours at a time, because silence, he had been told again and again, was the first and most important rule of the Galactic Council. Humans did not speak first. Humans did not speak unless spoken to. Humans, as the newest and smallest voice in a council that had existed for 12,000 years, waited. That rule was the reason Margaret Doyle had brought only 3 people, instead of the full diplomatic team. It was the reason Ethan's translator implant was set to receive only, not transmit, until council law permitted otherwise. It was the reason his hands were shaking now, because everything he had been taught told him that whatever was happening beyond those tall doors ahead, it was not his place to say anything about it. The doors opened on their own. The assembly chamber was larger than any structure Ethan had ever stood inside, a bowl of light and shadow that curved away in every direction, filled with the shapes of thousands of delegates from species whose names he had only read in briefing files. Today, none of them were seated. They stood in tight clusters at the edges of the room, eyes fixed on the center, where 2 delegations faced each other across an open floor, with the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. On one side stood the Vantor delegation, tall and pale, their robes patterned with moving lines of light that shifted faster when they were agitated. Right now the lines on their robes were nearly a blur. On the other side stood the Kesh, low and broad-shouldered, their skin the color of dark copper, their voices already raised in a language that Ethan's implant struggled to keep pace with. "Resource dispute," Owen murmured, reading from the data feed scrolling across his lens. "A mineral field on a moon, called Idrena. Both sides claim ancestral right. This has been open for..." He stopped. "Ethan, this has been open for 10,000 years. And it is closing today," Margaret said. "One way or another." A council official in pale gray robes hurried toward them, his face drawn tight with something between panic and relief that more bodies had arrived, even useless ones. He was Threll, a species built more for calm negotiation than crisis, and crisis did not suit him. "You should not be here," he said, his translated voice clipped and fast. "Not now. This is not the day for the newcomer's arrival." "We were summoned for the opening ceremony," Margaret said. "The ceremony is cancelled. The Vantor and the Kesh have moved past accusation into formal challenge. Do you understand what that means?" Ethan did, from his training. Formal challenge meant that under the Council's oldest law, the 2 sides now had the right to settle the dispute through combat authorized by ancient treaty, a right that had not been invoked in over 3,000 years because everyone had assumed the galaxy had grown past it. Watching the 2 delegations now, lined up like a wall of restrained fury, Ethan understood that assumption had just been proven wrong. "Can the Council stop it?" he asked, and immediately felt Margaret's hand close briefly around his wrist, a silent reminder. "You do not speak here. Not to officials, not to anyone. Not unless you are asked a direct question and given permission to answer it." The Threll official either did not notice the breach or did not care enough to correct it. "The Council can only intervene if a member of sufficient standing invokes the Elder's Pause," he said. "That requires a delegate ranked in the first 3 tiers of seniority. We have no one of that rank willing to act." "Why not?" Margaret asked. "Because whoever invokes it will be seen as taking a side. Whoever speaks now becomes part of the conflict. No one wants that weight. He looked past them, toward the chamber floor, where the light patterns on the Vantor robes had begun to pulse in unison. A visual warning Ethan's training told him meant they were entering a state the translation manuals called readiness. Ethan followed his gaze. In the middle of the chamber, an old Kesh delegate stepped forward from her line, raising both hands in a gesture that, according to his training files, was the final formal step before challenge became binding. Once she spoke the closing words, there would be no undoing it. The chamber had gone almost silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the ribs. Grace Whitfield, one of the junior human liaisons stationed permanently at the council outpost, appeared at Margaret's side, breathless. "They tried everything," she whispered. "Mediators, elders, even the chancellor. Nothing is working." The Kesh believe the Vantor stole records to fake ancestral claim. The Vantor believe the Kesh are only using this dispute to seize a strategic supply route. Neither side is willing to back down, and no one with the authority to stop it is willing to try. "What happens if it goes through?" Ethan asked, again without permission, again feeling Margaret's fingers tighten. Grace's face was pale. The challenge does not stay contained to a moon and a mineral field anymore. Both species have allies. Both species have fleets nearby. If this becomes a fight, it does not stay a small fight. The old Kesh delegate began to speak, her voice rolling out over the chamber in long, resonant syllables that Ethan's implant translated a half-second behind, words about ancestors, and blood, and land that could not be given away. Every delegate in the room had gone still, watching, because it seemed that no one, in 12,000 years of civilization, had found a way to stop a wall from finishing its collapse, once the first stone had already begun to fall. Ethan Hall stood at the edge of the chamber floor, close enough now to see the tension in the shoulders of both delegations, close enough to hear the tremor under the old woman's formal words, and felt something rise in his chest that had nothing to do with training, or protocol, or the careful silence he had spent a year learning to keep. He felt certain, with a clarity that frightened him, that he understood exactly what both sides actually needed to hear. And he was not allowed to say it. Margaret must have seen something change in his face, because her hand found his wrist again, firmer this time, a clear and final warning. "Do not. Whatever you are thinking, do not." The old Kesh delegate lifted her chin, drawing breath for the final line, the words that would seal the challenge and put 10,000 years of buried anger into motion, with no way back. The chamber held its breath, and Ethan Hall opened his mouth. "Wait." The word left him before he had decided to say it, and it landed in the chamber with a force that surprised even him. His translator implant caught it and threw it outward in every language the council recognized, layering his voice under a dozen others so that the single syllable rippled out across the room like a stone dropped into still water. The old Kesh delegate stopped mid-breath. For a moment nothing happened at all. Thousands of delegates turned as one, and Ethan felt the weight of every eye in the chamber land on him, a pressure so total it felt almost physical. Margaret's grip on his wrist had gone rigid. Somewhere behind him he heard Owen exhale a single word that was not meant for translation. The Threll official who had greeted them looked as though he might faint. Then the old Kesh delegate turned, slowly, and looked directly at Ethan Hall, a human she had never met, standing at the edge of a chamber where his species had not yet earned the right to be addressed, let alone to speak. Her eyes were dark and unreadable, and for a long, terrible second, Ethan believed he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. "You dare interrupt the right of challenge," she said, and the translation carried both fury and something else, something closer to disbelief. Every instinct in Ethan's body told him to apologize, to step back, to let Margaret smooth this over the way diplomats were trained to smooth over disasters. But he did not step back. He had already crossed the line. There was no version of this moment, where silence now would undo what silence before had already failed to prevent. "I do," he said, and made himself keep his voice steady, "because I think both of you are about to make a mistake you can never take back, over a misunderstanding that is still fixable." A murmur rolled through the chamber. Thousands of voices in dozens of languages, none of them approving. On the Vantor side, the light patterns on their robes surged bright red, a color Ethan's training told him meant something between insult and alarm. The Vantor lead delegate, a tall figure named Vel Ortain, whose robe carried more moving light than any other in his delegation, stepped forward with visible anger. "The newcomer species has no standing to address this floor," Vel Ortain said. "This is a breach of the oldest law we hold." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm breaking it anyway, because I don't think either of your peoples actually wants what is about to happen. I think you both believe you have no other choice left. I don't think that's true." Margaret Doyle stepped up beside him now, not to pull him back, because there was no pulling back from where he already stood, but to stand with him, her voice low and urgent only he could hear. "Ethan, whatever you are about to do, you had better be right." He did not feel right. He felt terrified. But he kept talking anyway, because stopping now felt more dangerous than continuing. "You believe the Vantor falsified ancestral records to steal your claim," Ethan said, turning to the Kesh delegate. "And you," he turned to Vel Ortain, "believe the Kesh are using an old dispute as an excuse to seize a supply route that has nothing to do with ancestry at all. Both of those things cannot be true at the same time, but you have spent so many centuries arguing about who owned the land first that neither side has actually asked the other what they are afraid of losing right now." "We know exactly what we are afraid of losing," the old Kesh delegate said sharply. "Our home." "And they're afraid of losing food," Ethan said. "Real, immediate, this season's food, because that supply route you're standing on top of right now feeds 3 Vantor colonies that are already short on rations. I read the trade logs on the transport this morning because I couldn't sleep and I had nothing else to do. Nobody has connected those two things out loud, because everyone in this chamber has spent 10,000 years treating this as a war about ancestors, when for at least one side, right now, today, it's actually a war about supper." The chamber had gone unnervingly quiet. Vel Ortain's light patterns dimmed slightly, no longer pure red, something more uncertain moving through them instead. "That is not the substance of our claim," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Maybe not on paper," Ethan said, "but it's why you're standing here today instead of a year from now, isn't it? Because the shortage got worse this season. Because someone in your government is afraid of what happens if those colonies go hungry before the next harvest cycle, and this dispute became the fastest way to be seen doing something about it." Vel Ortain did not answer, and the silence itself was an answer. Ethan turned back to the Kesh delegate. "And I don't think you actually believe the ancestral records were faked. I think you believe someone convinced you they might be, because it made an old argument feel new and urgent again, and gave you a reason strong enough to justify what you're about to do. I could be wrong. I've been standing in this room for 11 minutes, and I don't know your history the way you do. But I know what desperation sounds like, because my species has spent most of its short, messy history making exactly this kind of mistake, over exactly this kind of misunderstanding, because nobody was willing to stop and ask the obvious question before the fighting started. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber moved. Ethan realized his hands were shaking, and forced them still. Beside him, Margaret Doyle had not said a word, had not tried to soften or correct anything he had said, and he understood, distantly, that she had chosen to stand with whatever came next, rather than distance herself from it. The old Kesh delegate studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she turned to Vel Ortain. "Is it true?" she asked. "About the colonies?" Vel Ortain hesitated. On a normal day, in a normal negotiation, that hesitation might have gone unnoticed. In a chamber where every delegate present had been trained for centuries to read the smallest shift in posture, in tone, in the pace of light across fabric, it was unmistakable. "It is true," he admitted finally. "The shortage is worse than we have publicly said." "Then why did your delegation frame this as a matter of ancestral right, instead of asking for aid?" Vel Ortain's light patterns flickered, something that might have been shame moving through them. "Because asking for aid, in this chamber, in front of every species we have ever competed with for standing, would have meant admitting weakness. A land claim sounded stronger." The old Kesh delegate closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, some of the hardness had gone out of her face. "We would have given aid," she said quietly, "had you only asked. We have given aid before, to species with far less claim on our sympathy than yours. You chose war instead of a request, Because you were afraid of how the request would look. And you chose to answer a land claim with combat, Velortain said, instead of asking why an ancient dispute had suddenly resurfaced after 3 centuries of quiet. You could have asked that question yourselves. Neither delegation spoke for a long moment. The chamber, which had been braced for violence only minutes earlier, now held a different kind of tension. The uncomfortable stillness of 2 sides realizing they had both been wrong, in ways that had nothing to do with each other's honesty, and everything to do with their own fear. It was the Chancellor who finally broke the silence, an elder council figure Ethan had only seen in briefing images before today, an ophid whose long, silver form moved down from the high seats with unhurried grace. Her voice, when it came, carried through the chamber without need of translation enhancement, deep and resonant and very old. In 12,000 years, she said, I have never seen a newcomer species interrupt the right of challenge. She turned her attention fully to Ethan, and he felt that gaze like a physical weight. Nor have I seen a right of challenge halted by anything other than the elder's pause, invoked by senior standing. She paused, and yet here we stand. Guards, if that was the correct word for the black-robed council attendants, now moving toward the chamber floor from 3 directions, closed in around Ethan and the human delegation, with quiet, deliberate steps. Margaret stepped slightly in front of him, not to hide him, but to stand between him and whatever came next, as though her body could somehow absorb it. He has broken the oldest law this council holds, the Chancellor said. Whatever the outcome of today's dispute, that violation cannot be ignored. With respect, Margaret said, her voice steady despite everything. He may have also just prevented a war that would have cost thousands of lives on both sides. I would ask the council to weigh both facts before deciding what happens next. The Chancellor regarded her for a long moment, then looked past her, to Velortain, and to the old Kesh delegate, both of whom had lowered their formal stances, the immediate danger of the right dissolving into something that looked, for the first time in the entire encounter, like the beginning of an actual conversation. The right is suspended, the Chancellor said finally, and a wave of visible relief moved through both delegations, quiet exhales, shoulders dropping by degrees. The dispute will be returned to formal mediation, with the new information now on record. A murmur of something like approval moved through parts of the chamber, but the Chancellor was not finished, and when she turned back to Ethan, her expression had not softened. As for the human delegate who spoke without standing, she said, he will be brought before formal inquiry, to answer for a breach that, whatever its outcome, cannot be permitted to become precedent without the Council's full understanding of what has happened here today. The black-robed attendants closed the remaining distance, and Ethan felt a hand, not rough, but firm and absolute, close around his arm. Margaret did not fight it. She only looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he had not expected. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of stunned, cautious pride that she seemed almost afraid to let show. You just changed something today, she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. I don't yet know if that's a good thing or a terrible one, but you changed it. As the attendants led him from the chamber floor, Ethan looked back once. Velortain and the old Kesh delegate stood facing each other still, no longer as enemies mid-challenge, but as 2 old rivals who had just been handed, by an outsider with no standing at all, the first real reason in 3 centuries to actually talk. Behind him, the doors of the assembly chamber closed, and somewhere deep in the structure of that ancient building, word was already spreading through every delegation present that the newest, smallest species in the galaxy had just broken the oldest rule the Council had ever written, and it had worked. The inquiry chamber was smaller than the assembly floor, but it felt far more dangerous. There were no crowds here, no watching delegations from 1,000 worlds, only a raised panel of 9 council elders, a scribe, recording every word in a script Ethan did not recognize, and a single chair at the center of the room, where he had been sitting for the better part of 3 hours. Margaret sat behind him, along with Owen and Grace, permitted to observe but not to speak unless called. Ethan had never felt so alone in a room full of people. Describe again, said the elder, seated at the center of the panel. A Vantor named Ambassador Dren, whose light patterns moved in slow, deliberate pulses that gave nothing away. What compelled you to interrupt the right of challenge, when you had received no invitation, no standing, and no training in the specific protocols of that ceremony. I've already answered that question 4 times, Ethan said, as evenly as he could manage. Then you will answer it a 5th time, Dren said, because the answer you continue to give does not satisfy this panel. Ethan drew a breath. I saw 2 sides who were about to destroy something they couldn't get back, over a problem that had a solution neither of them had said out loud yet. I didn't have a plan. I didn't calculate the outcome. I just knew that if nobody said anything in the next 10 seconds, it would be too late to say anything at all. So I said something. One of the other elders, an insectoid thrall representative with compound eyes that caught the light in fractured patterns, leaned forward. That is precisely the problem, Delegate. You did not calculate the outcome. In 12,000 years, this council has built its every law, its every layer of protocol, specifically to prevent decisions from being made without calculation. You are describing an act of pure instinct, undertaken with no authority and no forethought, that happened, by chance, to work. We cannot build policy around chance. With respect, Ethan said, I don't think it was chance. I think it worked because nobody else in that room was willing to risk being wrong in front of everyone. Every species here has spent centuries building status, reputation, position. Speaking first, especially speaking wrong, costs something enormous to lose. I didn't have any of that to lose. I'm nobody here. I could afford to be wrong. A quiet ripple moved through the panel at that, something that might have been surprise. It was the 9th member of the panel who spoke next, a figure Ethan had not yet heard address him directly, an Ophid elder named Ilvath, whose silver form coiled with unhurried patience along the length of her seat. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than the others, but it carried a weight that made the room still. I do not think, Ilvath said, that this panel is asking the correct question. Ambassador Dren turned toward her. Elder Ilvath, this inquiry concerns a specific breach of law. I understand the charge, Ilvath said. I am asking whether the charge is the only thing worth understanding here. She turned her long gaze to Ethan. You said something a moment ago that I would like you to explain further. You said you could afford to be wrong. I would like to understand what that means, for your species, more broadly. Not for you alone. Ethan hesitated, unsure where the question was leading, but something in Ilvath's manner told him honesty was the only path that would serve him here. Humanity is young, he said. Compared to every species in this chamber, we're barely out of childhood. We don't have 12,000 years of careful tradition behind us. What we have instead is a history of constantly getting things wrong, quickly, in public, and having to figure out how to recover from it before the next disaster arrived. We didn't have the luxury of slow, careful process for most of our history. We had to act with incomplete information, all the time, because waiting for complete information usually meant it was too late to act at all. That sounds like a flaw, Dren said. It might be, Ethan agreed. It's also, apparently, the reason there's still a supply route feeding 3 Vantor colonies today, instead of a debris field where a moon used to be. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft click of the scribe's recording device. Ilvath's gaze did not waver. Elder Dren, I would like to propose something to this panel, and I suspect it will not be popular. Go on, Dren said carefully. I propose that before we determine punishment, we determine understanding. I propose a formal study, conducted with the full cooperation of the human delegation, into the trait this individual has just demonstrated. Not admiration, not endorsement, understanding. If this council has survived 12,000 years by building careful, deliberate process, and it very nearly ended today because careful, deliberate process could not move fast enough to prevent catastrophe, then I believe this council owes itself the diligence of understanding why an untrained newcomer succeeded where our oldest customs failed. The Thrall elder made a sharp clicking sound that Ethan's implant did not fully translate, something between disapproval and disbelief. You are suggesting we study a violation of law as though it were a discovery. I am suggesting, Ilvath said, that dismissing it as merely a violation of law may be the more dangerous mistake. The panel argued for nearly an hour after that, voices rising and falling in overlapping translation that Ethan's implant struggled to fully separate, elder against elder, Old alliances tested against older fears. Margaret sat rigid behind him through all of it, saying nothing, though Ethan could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from a struck match. In the end, the panel did not reach a verdict that day. Ethan was released from formal custody, but placed under what the council called observed standing, a status that meant he could move through the outpost freely, but was required to report daily, and could not leave council space until the inquiry concluded. It was 3 days later, in a windowless research annex deep in the outpost's administrative wing, that Ethan met Nathan Cole for the first time. Nathan was human, one of only a handful of scientists stationed permanently at the council outpost, tasked with the slow, careful work of cataloging human behavioral data for species who found humanity endlessly, sometimes uncomfortably, fascinating. He had thinning hair, tired eyes, and the restless energy of someone who had spent years being politely ignored and had suddenly, overnight, become extremely important. "You have no idea what you've started," Nathan said, waving Ethan into a cluttered office lined with data terminals and stacks of translated council archives. "Every research division in this outpost wants access to you. The behavioral scientists, the historians, even the linguists. Everyone wants to know why you did what you did, and more importantly, whether you could do it again. On command, under pressure." "I don't think I could explain it if they asked," Ethan admitted. "That's exactly what makes it interesting to them," Nathan said, dropping into a chair across from him. "Every species in this council has a decision-making structure built around consensus, precedent, and careful deliberation, because for most of them, that structure is what allowed them to survive long enough to reach the stars in the first place. Rash action got their ancestors killed. Caution got them here. It's baked into their biology in some cases, not just their culture." "And humans?" Nathan smiled, a little grimly. "Humans got here by doing both at once. Badly. Constantly. For our entire history. We nearly destroyed ourselves a dozen different ways before we ever left the atmosphere. We're not more careful than any species in this council. If anything, we're less careful. But somewhere in that mess, we also got very, very good at making a decision with incomplete information and adjusting fast when it turned out to be wrong. Most species here have never had to develop that muscle because their own history didn't reward it. Ours punished the alternative constantly, so we adapted." "That sounds like something you've said before," Ethan said. "I've been saying it in reports for 6 years," Nathan said. "Nobody in this outpost wanted to listen, because it sounded like a compliment we hadn't earned yet. Then you interrupted a rite of challenge that was 3 seconds from becoming a small war, and suddenly everyone wants to hear the theory." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp chime of an incoming alert on Nathan's terminal, a priority signal that made his expression shift instantly from thoughtful to alarmed. "That's an outpost-wide emergency channel," he said, already pulling up the feed. "Those don't activate for routine matters." The message that scrolled across the screen was brief, but its implications were not. A second dispute, unrelated to the first, had erupted in a lower chamber of the outpost between a delegation of the Ophid, Ilvath's own people, and a smaller trade coalition species called the Marrow, over an accusation of stolen technology involving council-restricted defensive systems. Unlike the earlier confrontation, this one had already escalated past formal challenge into something the alert simply labeled as active hostility, contained but volatile. "That's 2 floors down," Nathan said, already on his feet. "Ethan, that's directly below the human delegation's assigned quarters." They reached the corridor outside the lower chamber within minutes, joining a small crowd of officials and onlookers already gathered at a safe distance behind a shimmering containment barrier the council had raised across the hallway. Through the barrier, Ethan could see fragments of the confrontation beyond, raised voices, sharp gestures, the unmistakable posture of 2 groups who believed, rightly or wrongly, that they had run out of other options. Margaret arrived moments later, her expression tight with the particular alarm of someone realizing a coincidence might not be a coincidence at all. 2 disputes, in the same outpost, within the same week, she said. After 12,000 years without a single right of challenge invoked. "Ethan, does that strike you as an accident?" Ethan stared through the shimmering barrier at the standoff beyond, at the raised hands, the rigid shoulders, the terrible, familiar shape of a conflict that had convinced itself, Violence was the only remaining language left to speak. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think it does." Behind him, Ambassador Dren's voice cut through the gathered crowd, cold and clipped with barely restrained urgency. "Elder Ilvath's own people stand at the center of this. If this confrontation is permitted to escalate the way the first nearly did, the political consequences will reach far beyond a single dispute." Ilvath herself arrived a moment later, moving with none of her usual unhurried grace, her silver form tense in a way Ethan had not seen before. She stopped beside Margaret, her gaze fixed on the confrontation beyond the barrier, on her own people standing at the edge of something none of them seemed able to stop. "Someone timed this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Someone knew the inquiry into your delegate would leave this outpost distracted, its senior attention divided, and chose this exact moment to force a second confrontation. Who would benefit from that?" Margaret asked. Ilvath's expression, unreadable to most humans, carried something Ethan recognized instantly, because he had felt it himself only days earlier, standing at the edge of another chamber, watching another wall begin its collapse. Fear, carefully hidden, and running out of time. "I do not yet know," Ilvath said, "but I believe we are about to find out whether what happened in the assembly chamber was truly an accident of instinct, or the first sign of something this council can no longer afford to ignore." Beyond the barrier, a Marrow delegate raised his voice into a shout that needed no translation to understand, and the crowd gathered in the corridor went utterly silent, watching, waiting, bracing once again for the sound of something ancient and careful finally breaking beyond repair. Margaret Doyle did not wait for permission this time. "Drop the barrier," she said to the nearest council attendant, a request so far outside proper channels that the attendant simply stared at her. "Drop it now, before this becomes something none of us can walk back." "Human delegate, that barrier exists for the safety of all present. It exists to keep us from doing anything," Margaret snapped. "That worked exactly once, 3 days ago, until it very nearly didn't. Elder Ilvath, your people are on the other side of that barrier. Do you trust me enough to let us try?" Ilvath studied her for a long moment, then turned to the attendant and gave a single, sharp nod. The barrier flickered and fell. Ethan moved before he had time to think better of it, Margaret at his side, Owen close behind with a datapad, already pulling live translation feeds from both the Ophid and Marrow channels. The corridor beyond opened into a wide receiving hall, where the confrontation had grown tighter, more physical. Both delegations pressed close with the particular desperation of people who no longer believed talking would solve anything. "We need everyone to stop for exactly 1 minute," Ethan said, pitching his voice to Carrie, his translator throwing the words out across both languages at once. "Not to back down, just to stop, for 1 minute, and let someone say something that has nothing to do with blame." A Marrow delegate rounded on him, tall and sinewy, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who are you to interrupt this?" "Nobody," Ethan said honestly. "I'm the same nobody who stopped the last one of these from turning into a war. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking for 60 seconds. Because I don't think either of you actually knows what the other one is afraid of yet, and I think that's the only thing that matters right now." The accusation, once Owen's datapad had pulled the full record, and Nathan Cole had arrived to help untangle the technical claims, turned out to hinge on a misread engineering specification, a defensive system component that the Marrow had purchased through entirely legal channels, but had been mistranslated in a council trade ledger as a restricted military asset. No theft had occurred. No law had been broken. A clerical error, buried in translation, had nearly become the second act of violence the outpost had seen in a single week. It took 11 minutes to unravel. It felt, to everyone standing in that hall, like 11 of the longest minutes of their lives. When it was over, Ilvath stood very still at the center of the receiving hall, watching her own people lower their raised hands, watching the Marrow delegation exhale with the particular relief of people who had been braced for something far worse. Her silver form seemed to settle, the tension leaving it by degrees. "Twice," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Twice in 1 week. A conflict 12,000 years of careful process could not prevent, has been stopped by an untrained newcomer species with no standing at all." "That is precisely what troubles me," said a new voice, cold and precise. cutting through the settling hall. Ethan turned to find a Vantor delegate he had not yet met, standing at the edge of the receiving hall with an expression of careful, deliberate disapproval. Ambassador Dren introduced him quietly, under his breath, as Counselor Avith, a senior member of the Oversight Committee that had originally called for Ethan's inquiry, and, Ethan would learn later, one of the loudest voices arguing that the entire incident should end in humanity's expulsion from the Council, rather than any kind of honor. Two conflicts, Avith said, resolved by improvisation, by an outsider acting without authority, without training, without any accountability to the structures that have kept this council stable for 12,000 years. I do not see success in this pattern, Elder Ilvath. I see a demonstration of exactly how fragile our structures have become, and exactly how easily an untested species can be permitted to exploit that fragility. Exploit it, Margaret repeated. Counselor, my delegate walked into two situations that senior council officials, with centuries of training, could not resolve, and he resolved them both without harming a single person. By breaking law both times, Thursweth, success achieved through repeated violation is not evidence of virtue. It is evidence of a dangerous precedent, one this council would be foolish to reward rather than correct. The disagreement might have continued indefinitely had Ilvath not raised a hand, quieting the room with the simple authority of her presence. Counselor Avith raises a fair concern, she said. Repeated success achieved through violation cannot become policy simply because it has, twice, avoided disaster. But neither can this council continue pretending that our existing processes are sufficient, when twice in 1 week they have failed at the moment that mattered most. She turned to the full gathered crowd, her voice carrying the particular finality of a decision already made. I will propose to the full council that before any judgment is rendered on the human delegate, a formal trial be conducted, controlled, structured, supervised. If this trait the humans describe is real, let it be tested under conditions this council can trust, rather than argued about after the fact. Avith's expression tightened, but he did not object, not openly, not yet. Ethan would come to understand, in the days that followed, that men like Avith rarely lost an argument in the open. They simply waited for a better place to continue it. The trials began 4 days later, and they were unlike anything Ethan had trained for. The first was a historical simulation, a recreation of an ancient trade dispute between two long-vanished species, run through immersive projection technology that made the recreated chamber feel unnervingly real. Ethan was placed at the center, given only the barest outline of the conflict, and told to intervene before the simulation reached its historically documented, catastrophic conclusion. He succeeded, though not cleanly, stumbling twice through misjudged assumptions about the vanished species' customs before finding language that worked. The second was harder, a live mediation, arranged with the careful, deliberate consent of two smaller council species locked in a genuine, ongoing territorial dispute that had resisted resolution for nearly a decade. This was not simulation. The people in that room had real grievances, real fear, real stakes, that could not be reset if Ethan got it wrong. He walked in with Margaret at his side, Owen feeding him data through his implant, and for the first 20 minutes, nothing he said seemed to land at all. The two delegations grew colder, more entrenched, and Ethan felt the familiar terror of watching something slip away from him in real time. It was Owen, not Ethan, who caught the thread that broke the standoff, a small detail buried in decade-old trade records that suggested the true dispute had never been about territory at all, but about a broken promise from an earlier generation of leadership that neither side had ever formally acknowledged. Ethan seized on it, adjusted everything he had planned to say, and within minutes watched both delegations, for the first time in 10 years, agree to sit down together without a mediator standing between them. That was not instinct alone, Nathan Cole observed afterward, reviewing the data with visible fascination. That was instinct plus information, adjusted in real time when the first approach failed. That's the part they keep missing. It's not that you refuse to plan. It's that you're willing to abandon the plan the moment it stops working, faster than anyone else in that room. The third trial was the one that nearly broke him. It was designed, Ethan would later learn, by Counselor Avith's own committee, framed publicly as a routine continuation of the testing process, but constructed, privately, to fail. 2 delegations, both real, both volatile, both selected specifically because their historical animosity ran deeper and older than either previous dispute, were brought together under conditions that offered almost no useful data in advance, no time to prepare, and a translator feed that malfunctioned at the worst possible moment, cutting Ethan off from Owen's real-time support entirely. Standing alone in the center of that chamber, facing 2 ancient enemies with centuries of grievance between them and no support feeding into his ear, Ethan felt, for the first time since the assembly chamber, genuine, paralyzing doubt. He opened his mouth twice and said nothing. The silence stretched, and he watched both delegations' patience visibly thinning, watched the trial's council observers exchange glances that already looked like a verdict being written. Margaret, watching from the observation gallery, gripped the railing so hard her knuckles went white, forbidden by the rules of the trial from intervening. It was not information that saved him in the end. It was the same thing that had carried him through the assembly chamber in the first place, the willingness to be wrong out loud rather than silent and safe. "I don't have anything clever to say to you," Ethan finally admitted, his voice raw. No translator support, no data feed, nothing but the plain truth of the moment. "I don't know your history well enough to fix this, the way I fixed the last 2. All I know is that you're both still standing here instead of leaving, and I don't think people who have already decided to fight bother staying in the room this long. So I'm going to ask you the only honest question I have left. What would it actually take, today, for both of you to walk out of here still angry, but not at war?" It was not eloquent. It was not clever. It was, by every measure Ethan had been trained to value, an admission of failure. And it worked, not because it solved the dispute, but because it was so plainly, disarmingly honest, that both delegations, for the first time in the entire trial, stopped performing their anger long enough to actually answer the question. When the trial ended, the observers did not applaud, because applause was not the council's custom. But Ilvath, watching from the gallery beside Margaret, said something quietly that Nathan Cole would repeat to Ethan later, word for word, because he thought it mattered. "He did not win that trial through cleverness," Ilvath had said. "He won it by refusing to pretend he had an answer he did not have. I do not know if that is a trait this council can build policy around, but I no longer believe it is chance." The full council convened 9 days later, in the great assembly chamber where everything had started, to render its final judgment. Ethan had not slept the night before. He sat now in the small antechamber reserved for delegates awaiting formal address, listening to the distant murmur of thousands of voices filling the chamber beyond, and tried to steady his breathing the way Margaret had taught him. "Whatever happens in there," Margaret said, sitting beside him, "you already did the thing that mattered. Twice, under real pressure, with real lives at stake. Nobody in that chamber can take that away from you, no matter which way the vote goes." "Avith can still get us expelled," Ethan said. "He can try," Margaret said. "But he's going to have to do it in front of every species in this council, after we've shown them, 3 separate times, exactly what happens when nobody in that chamber is willing to speak first." Owen appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with something between excitement and alarm. "You need to see this before you walk in there." He handed Ethan a datapad, its screen filled with transaction logs, communication records, and a trail of encrypted transfers that Nathan Cole had spent the better part of a week untangling with the quiet, obsessive focus of a man who had finally been given a puzzle worthy of his skills. "The second dispute," Owen said, "the Ophid and Marrow confrontation. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a translation error that happened on its own. Someone altered the trade ledger entry deliberately, timed to trigger the misunderstanding during the exact week the council's attention was already split by your inquiry." "Who?" Ethan asked, though some part of him had already guessed. "The transfer trail leads back through 3 shell accounts," Owen said, "but the final authorization signature belongs to a senior aide on Councillor Avith's own oversight committee. Nathan doesn't think Avith pulled the trigger personally. But he built the room the trigger was pulled in." Margaret's expression hardened into something Ethan had not seen from her before, cold and precise. "He manufactured a crisis to make your first success look like an accident that would repeat itself into disaster. so the council would have no choice but to see humanity as a danger, rather than an asset. "Can we prove it?" Ethan asked. "Nathan thinks so," Owen said. "But proving it publicly, in front of the full council, is going to turn this from a quiet judgment into an open fight." Ethan looked at the datapad for a long moment, then handed it back. "Then let's make it an open fight." The doors to the assembly chamber opened, and Ethan Hall walked out onto the same chamber floor where, 9 days earlier, he had broken the oldest law the council held. This time, thousands of delegates were not frozen in the tense stillness of an unfolding crisis. They were watching him, openly, with the particular attention reserved for a decision everyone in the room understood was about to matter, far beyond the fate of one small delegation. Ambassador Dren presided from the raised central seat, flanked by the full panel of inquiry elders, Ilvath among them, her silver form coiled in patient stillness. Councillor Avith stood near the front of the gathered crowd, composed, unreadable, waiting. "This council has spent 9 days reviewing the actions of the human delegate Ethan Hall," Dren began, his voice carrying easily across the vast chamber. "3 formal trials have been conducted, alongside 2 real interventions of significant consequence. The panel of inquiry has reached a preliminary judgment, which I will now present, before opening the floor to final address." He paused, and the chamber held its breath in a way that felt, to Ethan, uncomfortably familiar. "The trait demonstrated by the human delegate," Dren continued, "appears to be neither accident nor recklessness, but a genuine capacity, cultivated by the particular, difficult history of his species, to act meaningfully under conditions of incomplete information, where established process has proven too slow to prevent catastrophe. This panel recommends that the Council formally recognize this capacity and consider amending the ancient speaking order to grant humanity limited standing to intervene in matters of active, escalating crisis, regardless of seniority." A wave of sound moved through the chamber, delegates murmuring in a dozen languages at once, some in evident approval, others in clear alarm. Councillor Avith stepped forward, before the murmur had fully settled. "I ask to address the floor," he said, and Dren, bound by procedure, granted it with a small, formal gesture. "This panel speaks of a demonstrated capacity," Avith began, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced authority of centuries of political standing. "But I would remind this council what that capacity has actually cost us. Twice now, this outpost has stood at the edge of catastrophe, precipitated by disputes that our own careful processes should never have allowed to escalate so quickly. I ask this council to consider whether it is truly wisdom we are witnessing, or whether we are simply watching chaos arrive faster than our own structures can contain it, and mistaking the human delegate's ability to survive that chaos for the ability to prevent it." "With respect, Counselor," Ethan said, stepping forward before he had fully decided to, though this time, at least, he had been granted the standing to speak. "I'd like to ask you something, if the council will permit it." Dren hesitated, then gave a small nod. "The second dispute," Ethan said, "the one between the Ophid and the Marrow delegations, the one you cited just now as evidence that our involvement invites chaos. I'd like the council to know that it wasn't an accident." The chamber's murmur died into total silence. "It was triggered deliberately," Ethan continued, "by an altered trade ledger entry, timed precisely to coincide with the week this council's attention was already divided by my inquiry. The authorization trail for that alteration leads back to a senior aide on Councillor Avith's own oversight committee." Avith's composed expression did not break, but something in his posture shifted, a fractional stiffening that Ethan, after 9 days of learning to read 1,000 alien faces, recognized instantly as the sound of a plan meeting an obstacle it had not accounted for. "That is a serious accusation," Avith said carefully, "made without evidence, before the full council." "I have the evidence," Owen said, stepping forward and handing the datapad up to the panel, compiled by Nathan Cole, of the Human Research Division, cross-referenced against council trade authorization logs. "Every transfer, every signature. We'd be glad to have it examined by whoever the council trusts to verify it." The silence that followed was different from the silence before, sharper, charged with the particular electricity of a room realizing it was witnessing something it had not been prepared for. Ilvath, watching from the panel, said nothing, but her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, from the datapad now being passed among the elders to Counselor Avith's carefully composed face. If this is true, Dren said slowly, it does not merely concern the human delegation. It concerns the integrity of this council's own oversight process. It is a fabrication, Avith said, his voice sharper now, the first genuine crack Ethan had heard in it. Manufactured by a species eager to secure standing it has not earned, willing to accuse a senior counselor of sabotage rather than accept the judgment this panel has already. Counselor Avith, Ilvath said quietly, and something in her tone made him stop mid-sentence. I would remind you that this panel has not yet rendered final judgment, and that an accusation this serious against a member of your own committee will be verified regardless of whether it proves convenient to your argument or not. If the evidence is false, it will be shown false, and the human delegation will answer for the accusation. If it is true, then the chamber will understand precisely why the second crisis unfolded the way it did, and precisely who is responsible for it. The verification, conducted over the following hour by a neutral team of council auditors, while the full chamber waited in restless, murmuring suspense, confirmed what Owen and Nathan had found. The aide responsible was identified and removed from proceedings before the hour was out, and though Avith himself denied direct knowledge to the last, the trail of authorization, timing, and communication left little room for the chamber to extend him the benefit of doubt. When Ambassador Dren called the floor back to order, the mood in the chamber had shifted entirely. What had begun as a judgment on one delegate's breach of law had become something far larger, a referendum on whether the council's oldest structures could still be trusted to protect it from threats that moved faster than careful process ever could. This council will vote, Dren said finally, on the panel's recommendation that the speaking order be amended, granting the human delegation limited standing to intervene in matters of active, escalating crisis, without requirement of seniority, effective immediately upon ratification. The vote, conducted through the ancient method of raised light along each delegation's ceremonial staff, filled the chamber with a slow, spreading glow, species after species raising their assent, until the vast bowl of the assembly chamber shone with a majority too large to mistake for anything but a clear and settled decision. Ilvath rose from the panel as the final tally was confirmed, moving down to the chamber floor with the unhurried grace Ethan remembered from their first meeting, though something in her bearing now carried a different weight, quiet satisfaction rather than cautious uncertainty. You should understand, she said to him, her voice pitched only for those close enough to hear, that this is not an honor this council has given you. It is a burden. You will not be thanked for speaking first, most days. You will simply be expected to. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, this council will look to your people to stand in the space no one else is willing to occupy, and it will not always end as cleanly as it has these past 9 days. I understand, Ethan said. I am not certain you do, yet, Ilvath said, not unkindly. But I suspect you will learn quickly. Your species tends to. Margaret Doyle stood beside him as the chamber slowly began to empty, delegations dispersing in low murmurs of conversation that would, within hours, spread the news of that day's vote to every corner of council space. Owen and Grace and Nathan gathered nearby, and even Avith, before withdrawing from the chamber under the watchful escort of council security, cast one last unreadable glance toward the small human delegation that had, in the span of 9 days, rewritten a law 12,000 years old. How does it feel? Margaret asked quietly. Ethan looked out across the vast emptying chamber, at the thousands of seats that would, in time, fill again with the same disputes, the same fears, the same fragile balance between careful tradition and the sudden, unpredictable moments when tradition simply could not move fast enough. Terrifying, he admitted. I think it's supposed to. Margaret allowed herself a small, tired smile. Good, she said. That means you're paying attention. They walked together out of the assembly chamber, past the tall doors that had once seemed impossibly distant to a newcomer species waiting quietly at the edge of the galaxy's oldest table, and out into a future where humanity, the youngest voice in a chamber of thousands, would no longer wait to be given permission to speak. It would simply be trusted to know when silence had already gone on too long.